The studio lights were blinding, the applause rhythmic and hollow. And the question was simple. What was the biggest mistake you made at your wedding? For Timothy Bliefnick, standing on the Family Feud stage, the answer wasn't a botched toast. It was the marriage itself. While millions laughed at his televised jab back in Quincy, Illinois, a dark architecture of resentment was already being built. 3 years later, that comedic punchline would transform into a grim reality of 14 shell casings and a shattered home, proving that some jokes are actually warnings in disguise. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. In the heart of the Midwest, where the Mississippi River carves a slow path past the brick buildings of Quincy, Illinois, the name Posel carried the weight of quiet, earned respect. Rebecca Bernadette Posel, known to everyone as Becky, was the kind of daughter who made excellence look like an effortless habit. Born in late 1981, she moved through the local school system not just as a student, but as a force of nature. At Quincy Notre Dame High School, she didn't just graduate. She stood at the podium as valedictorian, the first of a long line of honors that suggested a future without a ceiling. She was a scholar with a minor in chemistry and a major in biological science, landing a high-stakes role as a pharmaceutical sales representative for Sanofi Aventis almost immediately after college. She was successful, financially independent, and sharply intelligent. But for Becky, the corporate ladder felt hollow. She wanted to be where the blood and the heartbeat were. She eventually walked away from the high-heeled world of pharmaceutical sales to pursue nursing, her true calling. She graduated summa cum laude from the Blessing Riemann College of Nursing and Health Sciences, winning the Faculty Outstanding Senior Award while simultaneously raising a growing family. In fact, her peers often recalled the sheer grit she displayed when she gave birth to her third son during spring break of her senior year and returned to class after missing only a single day. In the emergency room at Blessing Hospital, Becky became more than just a clinician. She became a legend for her empathy. She was a certified trauma nurse specialist and a sexual assault nurse examiner, the kind of person who spent her 12-hour shifts holding the hands of the dying and her off hours assembling cribs for friends in need. In 2020, her dedication was recognized with a nomination for the International Daisy Award, a testament to a woman who once half-jogged down a hospital hallway so a terrified wife could catch one last moment with her husband before he was wheeled into surgery. While Becky was the quiet engine of the community, Timothy Bliefnick was its charismatic face. Tim was the local athlete, a former college football star who carried himself with the easy, broad-shouldered confidence of a man used to being cheered from the sidelines. He was educated, employed in the recycling industry, and deeply embedded in the town's social fabric as a youth football coach for his 3 sons. To the outside world, Tim and Becky were the quintessential Midwestern power couple. They had met during their undergraduate years at Quincy University, though the spark didn't truly ignite until a few years after graduation. They married on a crisp September day in 2009, a union that looked, from every angle, like a permanent success story. The years that followed were a blur of boy-mom milestones. They had 3 sons, Deacon, Grayson, and Arlo, who became the center of Becky's universe. She was the mother who didn't just buy Halloween outfits, she engineered them, once building Transformers costumes that actually functioned, allowing her boys to shift from robots to vehicles on the sidewalk. She was a constant fixture at St. Peter's Church and the Grade School Association, coordinating mother-son events and teacher luncheons with the same precision she used in the trauma bay. Tim was right there beside her, the active father, the coach, the man who seemed to embody the stable, suburban dream. For over a decade, they lived in a world of school posters, sports practices, and Sunday services. They were the couple people looked to when they wanted to see what a good life looked like in Quincy. But beneath the surface of the well-manicured lawn and the academic awards, the golden couple was beginning to tarnish, and the man who coached children on how to play fair was beginning to view his own home as a battlefield where only one person could walk away with the prize. The separation of Timothy and Rebecca Bliefnick wasn't a quiet drifting apart. It was a violent atmospheric shift that left shrapnel in every corner of their social circle. In January 2021, the facade of the Quincy golden couple finally disintegrated when Tim filed the initial paperwork to dissolve the marriage. What followed was not a standard legal proceeding, but a 2-year war of attrition, a nuclear divorce that would eventually see over 500 separate court entries. This wasn't just about dividing assets or scheduling holidays, it was a struggle for the very narrative of their lives. As the legal battle intensified, the physical distance between them grew, but the psychological tether only tightened. Tim remained in the family's sprawling home on Hampshire Street, while Becky moved into a modest rental property on Kentucky Road, just a mile away, but a world apart in atmosphere. In the trauma bay at the hospital, Becky was the one who stabilized the broken. At home, she was the one documenting her own slow-motion collapse. She began carrying a digital recorder. She changed her locks. She told her coworkers that she was living in a state of constant, low-level vibration. The kind of kinetic energy that comes from knowing you are being hunted. The most chilling evidence of this environment didn't come from a courtroom, but from the private, frantic messages Becky sent to those she trusted most. She wasn't just complaining about a difficult ex-husband, and she was providing a roadmap for a future murder investigation. In a text message to her sister, Sarah Riley, Becky wrote with haunting clarity that if she were ever found dead, her sister should look nowhere else but at Tim. She repeated this sentiment to her father, William Posel, stating that Tim had explicitly told her that he would kill her, and that he was smart enough to make sure no one would ever find the body. She wasn't being hyperbolic. She was a trauma nurse who understood the mechanics of violence. She saw the patterns. She recognized the escalation of a man who was losing his grip on the one thing he valued more than his reputation, his control. Then there was the surreal, public irony of the Family Feud episode. Taped in 2019, but haunting the airwaves long after, it featured the Bliefnick family competing for a cash prize. When Steve Harvey asked for the biggest mistake made at a wedding, Tim's response, said, "I do," was met with the kind of uproarious laughter that fits a game show's edit. But for those watching later, the clip felt like a confession hidden in plain sight. Tim had smiled for the cameras, played the role of the witty, disgruntled husband, and leaned into the caricature, while in reality, he was becoming increasingly embittered by the financial and social toll of the divorce. He was being ordered to pay child support and maintenance, figures that grated against a man who viewed himself as a provider. He was losing the big house. He was losing the daily access to his sons. And in the tight-knit streets of Quincy, the golden boy was starting to look like the villain of his own story. The tension reached a boiling point during a custody exchange in late 2021. According to Becky's accounts, the interaction turned physical. She alleged that Tim had shoved her, leading to a domestic battery charge, though the charge was eventually dismissed in a move that Becky's family viewed as a failure of the system. The event served as a terminal warning. Becky began telling her inner circle that Tim was losing it. She described him as a man who had traded his charisma for a cold, calculating rage. She suspected he was tracking her movements. She felt eyes on her rental house at night. She told her mother that she felt like she was living in a horror movie, waiting for the jump scare. Not realizing that the man she had once promised to grow old with was already in the basement of his own home, staring at digital maps and researching the silent mechanics of death. Every legal motion Tim filed seemed designed to punish her, rather than resolve the split. He sought a psychological evaluation for her, attempting to paint the highly functional, award-winning nurse as unstable. He contested every cent of support. He moved with a predatory stillness in the courtroom, while Becky grew thinner, more exhausted, her eyes reflecting the strain of working double shifts at the hospital, only to return to a home where she never felt truly alone. The architecture of a collapse was complete. All that remained was for the builder to decide when the final wall would fall. The night of February 23, 2023, was a standard Illinois winter's end, sharp, unforgiving, and silent. In the modest rental on Kentucky Road, Rebecca Bliefnick was finally alone. The relentless cycle of trauma nursing and the soul-crushing weight of her divorce proceedings had exhausted her. She was a woman who moved through life with a checklist, and by 11 p.m., the boxes were checked. The house was locked. Her scrubs were set aside. The 3 boys were with their father. For the first time in weeks, the air in the house didn't vibrate with the tension of an impending court date. But outside, in the shadows that pooled between the suburban streetlights, a different kind of checklist was being followed. One that didn't involve legal motions or custody schedules. The approach was silent. It didn't involve the roar of a familiar truck or the heavy footfalls of an uninvited guest at the front door. Instead, it was the metallic click of a bicycle chain and the soft hiss of tires on cold pavement. A figure moved through the neighborhood like a ghost, navigating the back alleys and the blind spots of the local security cameras. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a tactical infiltration. The perpetrator carried a crowbar, a tool designed for leverage and destruction, and a 9mm handgun. There was no hesitation. The entry was brutal. The crowbar was jammed into the frame of a sliding glass door at the rear of the house. Metal groaned against wood, a sharp, sickening crack that would have been the only warning Becky received. She was in the upstairs bathroom, a space that should have been a sanctuary. She likely heard the intrusion, the heavy, purposeful movement on the stairs. She didn't have her trauma kit. She didn't have her recorder. She had only seconds. The violence that followed was an explosion of mechanical precision and personal hatred. The first shot shattered the quiet of the residential street, followed immediately by a rhythmic, relentless succession of gunfire. 14 rounds. The small hallway became a kill zone. The shooter didn't aim for a warning. He didn't stop when the target fell. He fired until the magazine was nearly spent, standing over a woman who had spent her life saving others, ensuring that this time there would be no recovery. 8 of those 14 bullets found their mark. They tore through the air, through the drywall, and through Becky, who collapsed in the doorway of the bathroom. The overkill was a message, a physical manifestation of a nuclear divorce reaching its terminal velocity. Then the silence returned. The shooter didn't linger to steal jewelry or rifle through the medicine cabinet. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a scheduled execution. The figure moved back down the stairs, through the broken door, and melted back into the Quincy night on 2 wheels. The bicycle allowed for a quiet escape, a low-profile exit that a car's engine would have betrayed. Behind him, the house on Kentucky Road was left with the smell of gunpowder and a cooling body, and a silence so profound it seemed to pull the heat from the rooms. The morning of February 24th arrived with the mundane rhythms of a Friday. At St. Peter's School, the teachers waited for the 3 Bliefnick boys. Their grandfather, William Postle, was also waiting. There was a protocol for these things, a delicate dance of custody handoffs that Becky never missed. She was the valedictorian of her life. She was never late, and she never forgot. When the clock ticked past the drop-off time and Becky's phone remained unresponsive, the internal alarm that had been humming in the Postal family for 2 years finally turned into a scream. William drove to the Kentucky Roadhouse around 3:30 p.m., his hands likely tightening on the steering wheel with every passing block. The neighborhood looked the same as it always did. The cars were in the driveways. The trash cans were at the curb, but Becky's house felt off. He knocked, then pounded on the door. No answer. He circled the house, his eyes catching the glint of broken glass at the back. The sliding door was mangled. The leverage marks from the crowbar were deep, raw wounds in the doorframe. He entered the house, calling his daughter's name into the stillness. The air inside was heavy, trapped. He moved toward the stairs, each step a descent into a nightmare he had feared since Becky first told him that Tim had threatened her life. He reached the 2nd floor and found her. She was lying on the floor of the hallway, her body a map of the violence that had visited her in the night. The trauma nurse who had seen the worst the world had to offer was now its victim. William didn't need a medical degree to know his daughter was gone. The sheer volume of shell casings scattered around her, brass glinting against the carpet, told the story of a man who wanted to make sure she could never speak again. He called 911, his voice a ragged edge of grief and terror. When the first officers arrived, they found a scene that looked less like a burglary and more like a tactical strike. There was no disarray in the living room. The TV hadn't been touched. The laptops were still on the tables. The only thing missing was the life of Rebecca Bliefnick. The lead investigators noted the number of shots immediately. 14. It was an angry number. It suggested a shooter who was counting, or perhaps a shooter who had simply lost himself in the act of erasing a person. Outside, the The neighbors began to gather behind the yellow tape. They spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences about the nice lady who lived there, the nurse who was always seen with her 3 boys. They looked at the house, and then, almost instinctively, their eyes drifted a mile away, toward the big house on Hampshire Street where Timothy Bliefnick lived. The rumors that had been simmering in the local bars and church pews for months, rumors of a divorce turned toxic, of restraining orders and late-night arguments, now had a focal point. The police didn't have a suspect in custody yet, but they had a scene that spoke volumes. The precision of the entry, the choice of a bicycle for transit, the specialized knowledge of Becky's schedule, and the raw, unadulterated overkill of 14 shots pointed toward a perpetrator who didn't just want her dead. He wanted her gone. As the sun began to set over Quincy, the ghost on the bicycle was already home, perhaps washing his hands, perhaps checking the news, unaware that the 14 shots he had fired had left behind a trail of digital and physical breadcrumbs that would eventually lead the police straight to his door. The incident was over, but the investigation was about to tear the town of Quincy apart. The yellow tape around 1619 Kentucky Road did more than just cordoning off a crime scene. It served as a boundary between the Quincy that people thought they knew and a new, uglier reality. As the forensics team worked inside the cramped hallway, the Quincy Police Department began the grueling process of canvassing the neighborhood. In a town of 40,000, a murder, especially one involving a high-profile nurse, was an earthquake. Detectives moved door to door, their breath hitching in the frigid February air, asking the same questions to neighbors who were still in their pajamas, clutching coffee mugs with trembling hands. They weren't looking for a getaway car with a roaring engine. They were looking for a shadow. The initial frustration of the investigation was palpable. No one reported hearing 14 gunshots in the dead of night, a detail that baffled the lead investigators. It suggested the possibility of a silencer, or, more likely, the insulating power of Midwestern winter walls and the heavy sleep of a quiet Thursday night. The first break didn't come from a witness, but from the unblinking eyes of suburban security. A neighbor's doorbell camera, located a few houses down, captured a grainy, monochromatic image that changed the trajectory of the case. At approximately 1:10 a.m., a figure was seen pedaling a bicycle down the sidewalk, a silhouette wearing dark, bulky clothing and a backpack, moving with a bizarre, rhythmic calmness. An hour later, the same figure was seen pedaling back in the opposite direction. This was the ghost on the bicycle. For the first 48 hours, the detectives played with the idea of a red herring. Perhaps this was a local transient, a random prowler, or a thief who had stumbled into a situation far more violent than a simple burglary. They looked into reports of recent bike thefts and checked the local shelters. But the random prowler theory didn't survive the autopsy or the physical evidence at the scene. The entry was too precise. The overkill was too personal. A random thief doesn't fire 14 rounds into a victim in a second-story bathroom. The detectives kept coming back to the same troubling fact. The bicycle path seemed to lead toward the Hampshire Street area, toward the home of Timothy Bliefnick. The social echo in Quincy began to distort. Rumors moved through the local diners and Facebook groups faster than the police could verify facts. People recalled Tim's behavior in the days following the murder, his eerie, detached composure. When the police first informed him of Becky's death, he didn't collapse or demand to see her. Instead, he asked about the legal implications for his custody of the boys. It was a reaction that struck the officers as clinical, almost rehearsed. While Becky's family was holding vigils and drowning in a sea of why, Tim was reportedly seen going about his business, his face a mask of impenetrable athletic stoicism. By the third day, the focus shifted from a general search to a surgical one. The detectives weren't just looking for a bike, they were looking for the specific bike. They began reviewing footage from every nest and ring camera between Kentucky Road and Hampshire Street, creating a digital breadcrumb trail. They saw the cyclist emerge from an alleyway near Tim's house. They saw him navigate the side streets, avoiding the main intersections where the city's traffic cameras were positioned. This wasn't a casual ride, it was a charted course. It was a man who knew exactly which houses had cameras and which alleys offered the deepest shadows. The fear in the community began to curdle into suspicion. At the local schools, parents whispered about the Family Feud contestant, the man who had joked about his marriage on national TV. The irony was no longer funny, it was terrifying. The community was watching a real-life psychological thriller unfold in their own backyards. Detectives, meanwhile, were hitting dead ends with the weapon. No 9mm handgun had been registered to Tim, and no weapon was found during the initial cursory searches. They were dealing with a ghost who seemed to have vanished into the very neighborhood he had lived in for years. Then came the discovery that grounded the investigation in physical reality. In a wooded area not far from the path the cyclist took, investigators found a discarded bicycle, a dark-colored mountain bike that looked out of place among the winter brush. It didn't belong to any of the neighbors. It was a Huffy-style bike, a common, unremarkable model, the kind of thing you could buy for cash at a big-box store or a garage sale without leaving a digital footprint. Near the bike, they found something else, a set of footprints in the thinning snow and mud. The tread pattern was distinctive. It wasn't a work boot or a dress shoe. It was a Vans-style sneaker, a common choice for a man who spent his weekends coaching youth sports. The detectives now had a mechanical ghost and a footprint, but they needed the link that would put Timothy Bliefnick on that seat at 1 a.m. They began to dig into Tim's digital life, seeking the why and the how behind the who. They knew that in 2023, even the most careful planners leave a shadow in the cloud. The investigation was no longer about canvassing streets. It was about canvassing the mind of a man who thought he could outplay the system, just like he had outplayed his opponents on the football field. The search was narrowing, the community was holding its breath, and the man on Hampshire Street was about to find out that a bicycle and a crowbar weren't enough to bury the truth of 14 shots. The search for the ghost on the bicycle shifted from the frozen streets of Quincy to the sterile, flickering light of a computer screen. On March 1st, 2023, while the town was still reeling from the news of the 14 shots, the Quincy Police Department executed a high-stakes search warrant at Timothy Bliefnick's home on Hampshire Street. This was the moment the Golden Boy's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of forensic reality. Investigators didn't just find a grieving ex-husband. They found a man who had spent months academically researching the mechanics of murder and the tools necessary to perform it. The physical search of the house was a study in contradictions. In the rooms where Tim raised his 3 sons, detectives found the mundane artifacts of suburban life: sports trophies, school papers, and family photos. But tucked away in the darker corners of the property, they discovered a different narrative. They recovered a pair of dark-colored Vans sneakers. When the forensic team compared the tread pattern of those shoes to the long, deep furrows found in the mud near the discarded Huffy bicycle and the back door of Becky's rental, it was a perfect match. The shoes weren't just similar. The wear patterns, the specific way Tim walked and placed his weight, aligned with the prints left behind by the intruder on Kentucky Road. Then there was the crowbar. Hidden in the house was a heavy steel tool that bore microscopic traces of white paint. Paint that matched the finish of Becky's sliding glass door. A tool mark analysis confirmed that the damage to the door frame at the crime scene had been caused by this specific piece of metal. It was the physical bridge between Tim's garage and the shattered sanctuary where Becky had died. But as damning as the physical tools were, they paled in comparison to the digital trail Tim had left in the cloud. The extraction of Timothy Bliefnick's search history was like reading the diary of a cold-blooded tactician. The detectives didn't find a man searching for reconciliation or legal loopholes. They found someone who had transformed his curiosity into a weapon. They discovered that in the weeks leading up to the killing, Tim had repeatedly used his devices to look for information on how to force open a sliding glass door with a crowbar. He had researched the specific layout of the Kentucky Road neighborhood, focusing on blind spots in the local surveillance networks. Most chillingly, his search history revealed a deep interest in the chemical and physical ways to erase a human life, and the evidence of the act itself. He had queried phrases like how to wash off gunshot residue and how to make a homemade silencer. He had studied the Quincy police scanner frequencies, likely hoping to monitor the response time of the very officers who were now scrolling through his browser history. He had even looked for articles on common mistakes killers make, apparently believing that by identifying the errors of others, he could achieve a perfect, undetectable execution. The investigators also found evidence of a burner phone, a secondary device Tim had used to communicate and track location data, thinking it would keep his primary phone clean. But the digital shadows remained. Cell tower triangulation showed that on the night of the murder, while Tim claimed he was home alone sleeping, a device linked to him was moving in perfect synchronization with the ghost on the bicycle. The shell casings found around Becky's body provided the final, undeniable link. Forensic ballistics determined that the markings on the brass recovered from the hallway matched the unique mechanical signatures of a 9mm handgun, while the weapon itself remained missing, likely dumped in the deep, silt-heavy waters of the Mississippi River. Investigators found something just as incriminating in Tim's basement, an empty box for 9mm ammunition. The batch number on the box was a direct match to the spent casings found in the blood-stained hallway of the Kentucky Roadhouse. The 14 shots weren't just a random act of violence. They were the exact capacity of the magazine for the weapon Tim had researched and likely purchased in secret. The community's reaction to these revelations was a mixture of horror and a grim "we knew it" realization. The rumors of Tim's controlling nature and his family feud jab were no longer just pieces of local gossip. They were the context for a calculated assassination. Neighbors who had once invited Tim to barbecues now looked at his house with a sense of profound betrayal. The fear that a random prowler was on the loose was replaced by the much more terrifying reality that the threat had been one of their own, a man who coached their children by day and practiced his trigger pull by night. On March 13, 2023, the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion. Timothy Bliefnick was intercepted by the Quincy Police Department. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic standoff. He was arrested with the same eerie, athletic detachment he had shown throughout the 2-week investigation. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of home invasion. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the man who had joked about his biggest mistake on national television finally faced the reality of a mistake he couldn't laugh his way out of. The digital trail, the van sneakers, the crowbar, and the 14 shell casings had formed a cage of evidence that was tighter and more permanent than any legal motion he had ever filed. The search history of a killer had provided the roadmap, but the resolution of the case would now move to the courtroom, where the town of Quincy would have to listen to the details of how a golden couple ended in a hallway filled with brass and a silence that no game show could ever fill. The investigation was complete, but the trial would be the final public reckoning for a man who thought he was the smartest person in every room he entered. The trial of Timothy Bliefnick in May 2023 was a clinical deconstruction of a man who thought he was untouchable. In the Adams County courtroom, the prosecution didn't just present DNA and ballistics. They presented a character study. They played the Family Feud clip for the jury, allowing the sound of Tim's laughter to fill the room before cutting to the photos of the 14 shell casings in Becky's hallway. The contrast was a visceral punch. The defense attempted to lean into the someone else theory, suggesting a random intruder had navigated the alleys on a bicycle, but the weight of the search history was too heavy to lift. The jury saw a man who had Googled how to be a killer and then followed his own instructions. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. In August, the judge delivered the final blow, sentencing Timothy to natural life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Golden Boy had played his final game, and the prize was a cell he would never leave. Today, the streets of Quincy are quiet, but the silence at 1619 Kentucky Road is different. It's the weight of a story that ended too soon. 3 sons are left to navigate a world where their mother is a memory and their father is a number in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Timothy Bliefnick stepped onto a stage to joke about his marriage, only to orchestrate its brutal final curtain call. He played for a prize, but in the end, he traded his family, his freedom, and his soul for 14 shell casings and a lifetime of regret. The game is over, and nobody won. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.